Awesome, thanks very much. Well, it's kind of intimidating to be in this room because apart from anything else, the schedule today is so varied. It seems like there's so many different types of topic. It's also intimidating because, as Imran just reminded us all, the North never forgets. So if I screw up, it will be indelibly marked on everyone's memory. And also there are ducks heckling as well, so there's plenty to distract us. Yeah, as was just pointed out, there's a bit of a tautology here. It's strange to come with a title which, first of all, is so difficult to say out loud. Dynamic static site strategies is a bit of a gobful. And yes, dynamic and static in the same sentence seems a bit strange. I'll be honest, I was trying to find a title that would be interesting when we're talking about static site generators. It doesn't necessarily sound at first glance like the best, most exciting topic. Yes, I'm a JavaScript developer. I'm a jumped-up web developer, really. And so I was looking for an interesting way to talk about static site generators, SSGs. I was fumbling around with the title of SSG Whiz for a few minutes, but kind of realized that sounds just like the worst possible name for a battleship. So we're stuck with dynamic static site strategies, and I won't be using that expression again if I can help it. A quick introduction just about myself before we get started. My name's Phil, and I work at an agency in London, kind of a big advertising agency in London, working for brands like Nike and Google, Microsoft, people of that nature, and we make stuff for them. As you might expect for someone who's come from an advertising agency, I'll have got a very creative Twitter handle, which is just my name. So if you have any questions that we don't manage to get through, I'm not sure how we're going to do on time, do my best to stay on time, but if there are any questions or if you disagree, grab me afterwards, tweet questions at me, however you want to. Oh!
We can't hear you.
Oh.
Hello.
Are these turned on? I put them in my pocket. A bit higher. Are they better if they're closer? Are they working?
Does it work?
There's a man fumbling in my back pocket.
It's like, just think it's like on telly.
Oh, off, on. Is that better?
Yeah.
That better?
Hey.
So at the point that I discover the on switch, I should point out, so my role at RGA is technical director, so obviously doing a fabulous job. Okay, back on track. So at RGA, we do a bunch of work for clients, as I was just mentioning, and yes, I'm a web developer, but we do all kinds of things, but I care about the web and how we work in the web, and particularly to do with the front end. So I know there's a lot of different interests in the room, but this is kind of tailored towards people who might be making a website of some size or scale, be it very large or very small. It's a weird time, I think, for front-end developers. I used to have conversations with people like this where they'd ask me what I did. So I'm a software engineer, and you can't move in London without bumping into another software engineer. So someone would always say, "Oh, what language do you work in?" "I work in JavaScript," and then they'd kind of have this particular reaction. And that's frustrating as a front-end developer or someone who works with JavaScript. Already getting stick for it today, so thanks for that. But the times are changing a little bit. I think the tools and the engineering that front-end developers have at their disposal are just vastly different to what we used to have before. They change very quickly, and there are lots of new cool things coming along. So it's hard sometimes to keep up with the trendy new tool that's around. I kind of like to talk about the hipster tax of trying to stay current on what's the new cool thing. So why bother with a talk like this? How does this kind of fit in? I'll try and give some context, and then we'll dig into some examples as well about how this stuff can work. So just kind of glancing back for this bit of context, the good old days of building stuff for the web. First time that I made anything for the web was when I was at university, and I discovered I had this home directory that I was given, and in there was this mysterious folder, the htdocs directory, and I had no idea what that was. And I later learned that this is the hypertext documents directory, and anything I put in there magically would appear on this URL. So I had this power to kind of get things published that I never used to have before. Before anyone reaches for their phone and tries to look, there's nothing there anymore, sadly. So you won't be able to see my first web page with its hit counter of 8 on there. But the point was that there's this lovely process of making things. It was really simple. You'd write text in a text editor, then you'd save it, and then you'd go to your browser and you'd refresh it, and you'd see the result of what you'd just done. It was this kind of instant feedback loop. And then you'd kind of just repeat and just rejoice in this lovely kind of instant gratification. And so I kind of went on building things like this for a little while, but then before too much time passes, you want to be a bit more ambitious, and you want it to become a little bit more dynamic. And so my first port of call there was, a friend of mine, a fellow student at the time, who was much smarter than me and had done much more of this. And I asked him, how do I make things more dynamic on the web? And his response was this. He said, oh, you need a CG bin. And I looked at him blankly, and I was kind of imagining a trebuchet and Dusty Bin from 321. And what he meant was, a CGI bin. That's what he was talking about. And so this kind of led me to this world of starting to dabble in Perl and getting things talking to databases. And it was kind of the first step into plumbing and infrastructure and the stuff that, frankly, makes building for the web a little bit hard these days. So, we expect to be doing this. Sites do a lot, and they're very dynamic, so we expect there to be this kind of infrastructure behind them. But I think there is a bit of an opportunity for a slight return to simplicity for that kind of instant gratification time of developing for the web. And so now we should look at what the challenge is in doing that. And let's look at what maybe a client might need. And client could be anything here. It could be, a big client, a small client. It could be an internal project. It could be a site for yourself. But there's some common threads here. So, you're going to make something for the web. It's going to need to be a beautiful site with clear content that's well articulated. Going to have to have good browser support so it can go anywhere. And it's going to need to render quickly and get into the browser and perform fast because time is money and attention is money. And then there's other aspects as well, like it's going to need to be easy to update, and it might need some kind of content management system which brings their own issues. And we need to make the content very dynamic, and hopefully the client will want to have sensible URLs, and if they don't, we should try and teach them about that and the value of that. And so there's lots of things that a client might ask for. Commonly, where I'm working, a client will come and they're learning enough about this, and they say, oh, well, we want a mobile-first responsive web app. And there's plenty of buzzwords mangled into one sentence there. They usually phrase it like this. They say, I want a mobile-first responsive web app, because I think it's a trending term that they've seen somewhere, plenty of buzzwords. What they're asking for is they're asking for a website more often than not, and that's what it comes down to. So when we look at this kind of pot of things that might be part of delivering a website, this stuff on this side is the kind of thing that needs some infrastructure. It's a little bit trickier to do. So the question that I'm kind of posing here today, is this only possible with a dynamic server architecture? And well, as you might expect, either we're done now, or I'm suggesting the answer to that question is no. It is possible without that. So then, how do we have a static architecture to give us dynamic features? Just grab some water. Now, how do we do that? And really, in order to answer that question, we have to figure out what dynamic actually means. It could mean a bunch of different things. It could be meaning personalized content that's delivered just to you as an individual. Or it could mean gathering user-generated content and do things with that. But often it could also just mean how quickly does the content refresh? And what I mean by that is, what's the time to publish? How quickly can we update it and keep the content on the site fresh? So, sorry to say this expression, but in the enterprise, that can be quite a challenge. Now, a lot of the clients that I work with have these two concepts when it comes to deploying things into their infrastructure. And we're building things for them to then run later on. And they have these notions of a code deployment and a content deployment, and then they being very, very different. They often think of code as the plumbing, the infrastructure, the thing that's going to run as logic on their server. Whereas content, they're talking about not just the text, but actually it's the HTML and the CSS and the things that maybe don't execute in the back end. And the rigor that it puts over what code the code deployment versus the content is quite different. The code deployment will often have all kinds of audits and constraints on it, whereas content you can actually replace really quickly. So then there's an opportunity here to try and move from the code deployment more to the content deployment, and actually be much more dynamic and get things deployed much faster. To do that, we need to really consider honest use cases. And I was talking earlier on about what does dynamic actually mean. And of course, there are many different kinds of sites. So for the purposes of this exercise, we're not really going to talk about targeted content. We're not going to be talking about things that are delivered just to you as a particular user. And we're also going to be looking at, frankly, it's kind of read-only, but also read-often sites that might change very rapidly and be deployed very quickly and very regularly. And if we do that, I think we've got an opportunity to make everything faster. So this is all based really on this groundbreaking approach from 2002, this recommendation which is a great term of, you should bake rather than fry. So bake, don't fry is a great term that, that was kind of coined by this guy, Aaron Swartz, who was also a great contributor to the Creative Commons. And way back in, I think it was 2002, Aaron wrote this great article when he was exploring ways to make his site a little bit more easy to maintain. And he had a blog, as many people did at that point. Blogging was really getting popular, and the infrastructure that he needed to run the blog was getting tricky. And so he was looking for this opportunity to do something a bit different. And so this notion of baking a version of a site that you then deliver to people rather than frying it on demand is where this expression comes from. And he discovered this tool called WebMake, which is a CMS written in Perl. So we're back to Perl already. And that was basically a static site generator. Given that it's a CMS, it's written in Perl, it's from the early noughties, it's going to have a good logo. Boom. There's WebMake. There's the logo for WebMake. It's the only time I'll ever use flames in a slide deck, I promise. But this is the tool he was using, and it was helping him to focus where he needed to. He's saying, I care about not having to maintain cranky AOL server, Postgres, and Oracle installs in 2002. And yes, I completely feel that pain. It's infrastructure that you've got to maintain for the life of your site. So he's trying to avoid that. And when you can reduce this complexity, then you can ease the development process, and also you increase the portability of what you're building. You're building something in a development environment that you can deploy anywhere. You're not then shackled to a particular server environment or a host or a particular infrastructure. So are there many people in the room who have now or have ever had a blog? Just a kind of a show of hands. Oh, a bunch of you, excellent. Has anyone ever seen a screen like this? Anyone ever? Yeah, so a bunch of people. I mean, WordPress is a fantastic product, and I'm not bashing WordPress at all. I think it does an incredible job. But this is just kind of highlight. I love the fact that error, success. Hooray, so who knows what's going on. And my point here is about confidence and the fact that there's things to maintain when you've got a site that lives on a database and it has particular versions of infrastructure in the back end. Over time, things get updated and things break. And if you can take that kind of machinery out of the mix, then your confidence can increase. And there's another dirty expression I'm going to use. Can't believe I'm standing in front of people saying enterprise compliance. It's a horrible expression. However, going back to this code deployment versus content deployment thing, I've worked with lots of clients where they're very, very rigorous about what machinery you can put into their infrastructure, and they'll perform this rigorous security audit and do penetration testing and load testing and all of that stuff that takes time and sometimes you won't get through. And lots of clients that I work with will not allow WordPress in the infrastructure because they see it as an attack vector. So there's that stuff that we can do away with, and there's also performance, and it isn't really just about performance, but there are some kind of cheap performance gains to be made if we go for a static site infrastructure, because it's all based on a file architecture. You're just serving files, and that's really fast to service those requests. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the why, and then we'll show some examples. So fear not, there is examples coming along. But obviously, when you're looking at how things can be simplified, costs come into here as well. The hosting costs of just hosting something which is just static files is much, much lower than it could be with something a bit more complex. I mean, we've seen the rise of all kinds of free and very cheap static hosting providers. And for us, someone mentioned the issue of wanting to be thrifty earlier on, and for me, this has saved me a bit of money in the past, but at scale, this can be huge when we're trying to service lots of requests to a large audience. And I've already kind of mentioned maintenance and how that can be made simple, because we've got less infrastructure, fewer servers, less code, less moving parts. So this stuff can be more powerful and just more pleasant to work in. So then, how does this happen? What actually makes this a possibility? So we should look at a couple of tools and things that enable this for us to actually have a more dynamic site just through easier iteration. So a few factors. There's generators, automation, and hosting. We're just going to look at each of those and some examples of those in turn. So we talked earlier on, static site generators is kind of the direction of this thing. So what kind of generators are out there? A lot of people maybe will have heard of Jekyll. It's very, very popular. That's kind of the leading static site generator. It's built in Ruby. And of course, if you're going to have Jekyll, someone's going to write hide. So Python has hide. And then there's a bunch of others: middleman, docpad, assemble, harp. And you see a range of languages coming in here. But the list is ridiculous. There's actually static site generators.net, which is, of course, is built with a static site generator. It's built on docpad. It's currently listing 274. In fact, that number, since I put that slide together, is now 290. So blink and the number increases. Everyone wants to make one of these things now. And so finding the right one is kind of tough. Kind of harks back to this HIPT attacks I was talking about earlier on. But Jekyll is this leading static site generator that lots of people use, and it's incredibly powerful. And we use it a lot at RGA, and I use it personally quite a lot to good effect. But of course, it's not for everyone. Remy Sharp, who's famously a bit of a JavaScript guy, is dabbling, trying to get things installed because it's a Ruby gem, and he's quickly getting into the position of not being able to manage the dependencies. And there's still infrastructure there, but it's in his development environment. And this is an example of kind of the stack getting smaller. We're perhaps moving away from lots of infrastructure in the back end, but we're bringing it into the development environment a little bit. And I think this has got us from the big stack maybe down to the small stack, because we're still building things with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but we also need Ruby at this point to run that generator. But that's okay, because we're still finding tools that address this issue that Aaron Swartz was talking about. The weakness with this bake philosophy that he was talking about is dependencies. It's difficult to figure out when pages change, which other ones need to be rebuilt. But thankfully, due to things like Jekyll, that's kind of solved. And the reason for that is that we've now got really rich templating engines. They've got partials and templating inheritance and logic and all of these things that mean that actually we can regenerate an entire site very quickly when just one small thing changes, and that propagates around the site. Templating engines are all over the place. If we just kind of have a look on Wikipedia down at the templating engine section, there's all kinds of greatest hits in there, from like closure templates, there's mustache, ginger, there's a bunch of them in there. It's almost as many as static site generators themselves. There's a bunch to choose from. Got to be a bit careful on this page, because I noticed after putting that in that static page generators itself was talked about, but they're referring to Dreamweaver and Flash and Front Page, which isn't the route I'm going down. I'm going down a completely different route, so perhaps a slight divergence there. But we're just coming back to this notion of dependencies, managing dependencies for the pages that are being redeveloped, but also dependencies of the infrastructure itself. I don't know if many people are familiar with Atwood's law. Does anyone know Atwood's law? A few people. Atwood's law states that any application that can be written in JavaScript will eventually be written in JavaScript. So again, another tip of the hat for the JavaScript developers in the room. But this extends, right the way through to managing dependencies. Anyone who's built things with Node and using JavaScript on the server will have encountered NPM as a way to manage modules and dependencies. There's a lovely little nugget in NPM that I discovered that so many people were mistyping install that isn't all actually works as well, because it's a common typo. So I love the fact that was put in there as a little nugget for anyone who makes that mistake regularly. But at this point then, when we've got JavaScript templates, JavaScript static site generators, JavaScript managing the dependencies on the server, it actually moves us down from this small stack to a really tiny stack, a very, very focused set of tools and skills that people are going to need to make this stuff work. And so a good example of that one, filling that picture, Jekyll was built on Ruby. Harp, one of the many built on JavaScript, does very much the same tool, and it's got the kind of things that you need for creating sites statically and generating them. It's got kind of pre-processing. It's got different templating engines that you can use, and support for Sass and Less, and pre-compiling your CSS. Support for CoffeeScript if that's your thing, and it really kind of gets to the point that we've got this rapid and powerful site generation process effectively solved. So we'll move along from generators to automation. Now, automation is a big one. It really helps you be much more dynamic in the sites that you're publishing. An agency that I used to work at, which I've got written down in my notes here as if I've forgotten where I work, but I'll never name it because this story's too shameful. The first day I arrived there, I got pulled into a conversation, someone saying, oh, we're deploying a site today, but we're having a bit of a nightmare, can you help out? And it was a site for, it was for part of the NHS. It was a fairly large audience, and we didn't want to screw it up. And the deployment process that we had was this. There was a developer, and what he did was he opened a window on his machine, and that window had all of the files that were in the website. And then he opened another window, which was his FTP view of the production server. And then what he did was he would grab some files, and he would drag them across, and he would drop them there, and then he'd hit refresh, and he'd go, no. And he'd grab another one, and he'd hand that over. And my palms went sweaty, and my mouth went dry as I was watching this thing. And this production server being gradually kind of piecemeal mangled. Now, this is an opportunity to really shoot yourself in the face, and you get around this with some automation. Automation tools are really fantastic for avoiding this kind of thing. They make deployments repeatable, they make them predictable, and they're kind of self-documenting because it's a script that you run. But critically, for the purposes of this conversation, they make them really low friction. It means that anyone can deploy, and you can deploy with confidence, and you can deploy really regularly. Now, I used to use a tool called Fabric for this, which is written in Python, and it's local and remote task automation. But Atwood's law is, of course, in effect again here. So we're over to JavaScript, and lots of people are talking about Grunt for running tasks and automation. Of course, there's Gulp, which is another one. There's another one called Brunch, and it won't be long before we've got Belch, Burp, cough, hiccup, sneeze, goodness knows what. And we're back into the hipster zone again. But these things are coming. Register the domain quickly. But the key is that there's a really fertile ground here for automation and really making your deployments much simpler. And they're the key to making things more dynamic. Kind of rattling along, because I do want to get to some specific examples. Hosting. I mentioned hosting earlier on. Hosting static sites is either free or trivially cheap very often now. And it's incredibly easy. This one, Site44, just turns any Dropbox folder into your web root, which means you can drag and drop things into a Dropbox folder and have it deployed. So we're in danger of getting into this environment again, this strategy again. But you could automate the copy of stuff from there to there, script that. That's fine. GitHub Pages, I think many people have encountered. GitHub will host static sites for you for free, and that's just an incredible resource. It makes it really simple. Another one called BitBalloon, which is the same deal, but they also do a little bit more. And I love the fact that you can even get started by dragging your web root onto their website, and they'll do a load of stuff for you and just host it. BitBalloon will host it, but they'll do a lot of optimization of the code that you drop there and actually crunch it all for you. They'll manage the CDN and actually make things really, really rapid for you. And of course, you can automate your deployments. You don't have to drag and drop. You can do things through the command line. And they do a bunch of other funky shizzle as well, which we may or may not get to. Finally, though, we can get some examples. So starting off with the most important, but the simplest example I could find. It's most important because it's the beer club website at the company I work for, where we taste beer every week. But it's very, very simple, and it's got a very simple workflow, so it's good for illustrating a particular point. Now, it is powered by nerds because there are developers who have built this thing, but I'm trying to demonstrate that actually it's a very, very simple workflow, and it doesn't need to be just developers who can use this. It's hosted on GitHub Pages because it's convenient, and so that means that I don't have to pay for any of the hosting, any of the version control, any of the deployment. That's all taken care of, and even the site generation, because GitHub will parse your Jekyll site for you. You dump the code up there, it'll generate it, and it'll host it right away for you. So the deployment process is this. We make some changes to what things looks like, and then we write git push origin gh pages, and it commits the code. It's safely deployed up into the cloud. I used the word cloud, sorry. And our site is deployed. Because we want it to be dynamic, we want it to be easy to update. And so there's a nice little thing in Jekyll, which has been around for a few versions now, where they give you opportunities to iterate over a data object. Now, what that ultimately means is you've got a directory, a data directory, and any file you put in there, which is in a YAML format, which is a very simple structured data format, you can then have access to all of the data in there to do stuff with. So we have a file called drops.yaml for all of the drops of beer that we're tasting, and we just iterate over that in our templates, like this. So as I said, it's the simplest possible site. It's just a list of beers we've tasted and a photo of it. Some of these, by the way, are not recommended at all, but you've got to kiss a lot of frogs. But the point I wanted to show you is where this is managed. So this is on GitHub, the data directory and the drops.yaml file. And it's very, very easy to scan that and understand the structure of that. And if we ever want to update and add a new one, we don't even need to check out the code. We can go to GitHub. We can do it right here because, of course, you can edit in this environment and make the changes. So that experience is to be recommended. This beer, which was chocolate, peanut butter, and banana ale, I'd give it a miss. But the point is that you make the change there, you save the change, it recompiles your static site for you and deploys it. Easy peasy. The proof of the pudding, that wasn't a deliberate pun, Cake Club, was something that forked this. So a friend of one of the guys who worked on this, she wanted to do the same thing where she worked for cakes. And again, it's that simplest possible example. It's not a complex site. It's a very simple workflow. But critically, this one isn't powered by nerds. So it proves out that workflow is kind of accessible to many people. Now, this is all about simplicity, but simplicity doesn't mean dumbing down. I know this is a very, very simple linear example, single-page site. But simplifying things actually lets us focus on what really matters, and that could be a bunch of different things. We actually used the same approach when we worked with Google on a site that they published a few months back. And it was for the Chrome Developers Relations team. And it was this site, Web Fundamentals, that we designed and we developed with Google. And this is built on Jekyll, and we managed a lot of the code in the open on GitHub. It actually is deployed into Google's cloud infrastructure, but the point is that it's static files. It's hosted on Google. Getting code hosted on a google.com domain is incredibly difficult to do. So building things statically like this meant that we were able to deploy into a very difficult infrastructure. And it also meant that while we were building this, we could concentrate on the effort of authoring the content rather than all of the issues that go with building some kind of CMS or what have you. So this kind of proved out to be a successful strategy there. Again, it helps us focus on what matters. But of course, there are some limitations. I've shown you a couple of sites which are, yes, very quickly updated, so dynamic in that sense, but still ultimately static. What about things like search and comments? Because you often want those kind of things on a site. So I've got a couple of examples how you can bring search and comments to life. I'm going to stick with Jekyll. You could obviously switch out any of these static site generators for a lot of these things. So this example is built on Jekyll. It uses a very simple search index. Search can be a very complex problem to solve. But equally, it can often be a very simple thing. A lot of search facilities can be quite simple to be effective. So this just uses a very simple search index. It's written in JavaScript, but it does use progressive enhancement. So I'll show you how JavaScript isn't always required for this to work. It's on my site because that's where I play and experiment with a lot of these things. My site is it's just a blog, and as you'd expect, the template engine that runs this is just iterating over a load of posts and then getting them into a template. And I'm going to show you some code just very, very briefly. So this is a snippet of one file that's in the source here. It's the search.json file. And what this is doing is Jekyll is going to walk through all of the posts that I have in the site. And for each post that it finds, it's going to build another entry in this JavaScript object. And so all it's doing, it's giving it a title, putting the URL in there, the date, and then the actual words, the content of that article. And it does a few bits and pieces with these filters up here. Like it grabs the content and it strips out all of the HTML, so we don't really want the elements in there, we just want the text. And then it also uses this little filter word map, which is all that does is it makes all of the words unique, and it takes out a bunch of small words that aren't going to be useful in a search, like on, in, me, of, those kind of things. All with the interest of trying to get the data set smaller. And it loops over those, and then it kind of spits out this search.json, which looks a little bit like that for every entry. And so what that means that we've got is we've got an inline search on the page, because the page will load up that search JSON. And then with JavaScript, we can just interrogate that. So it feels really, really snappy. As you type, it's looking at that blob of JSON and then just showing you the results accordingly. So you've kind of got a simple search tool built out really very, very quickly. Now, anyone who cares about performance on the web is probably scratching their head and thinking, hang on, you're taking all of your blog posts and whacking them into one blob of JSON and then putting them on every page. What about the page rate? What does that do for the size of the site? And it's a fair point. But the key is you can load this asynchronously after the page. So you deliver the page, you render it, and then after it's rendered, you go and get the search, because people aren't doing that straight away. So people are already reading the content after you, while you go and get the search data. Also, this piece of content is static, and it can be cached, and it can be gzipped. So it actually compresses down quite low, and you can cache it to high heaven and deliver it quite quickly. And in fact, you can go further than loading it asynchronously. You can actually load it contextually, so you actually don't load it at all until you suspect someone's going to use it. And just as an example of that, we'll kind of look at this again. I'll open up the web inspector here and reload the page in a second. There we go. And so we can see straight away, like the page loads reasonably quickly, and we just load in the assets of the HTML, the CSS, a couple of images. At that point, the page is rendered, and then we get the JavaScript that's going to manage this stuff. And then there's a couple of things for analytics and whatnot. And there's no search JSON in the page there. So we only actually load that once we go and click on search to produce that text box. So there we go. We open that up, and then search JSON is requested and returned. And by the time you've got your cursor up there and you start typing, it's there ready to use. So you can offset this overhead of getting the page, getting the content loaded into the page. Now, this is JavaScript only, this implementation, and I did promise some progressive enhancement. So how do we handle that? Well, it's actually really, really simple to do, because we only add this search mechanic with JavaScript. Until then, the search link up there is just a link to the search page. So turn JavaScript off there, reload the page, and when we hit search, okay, then it'll take us to the search page instead of putting the form there. And the search page has a search form of its own. It's got access to the tag, so you can go and navigate the page, the site rather. But this search form is just a form that posts to Google. It's just Google's own embedded search form. So, we've still got that search facility. We haven't lost anything, and we're just using the power of Google here to index and give us a search engine that they do quite nicely. And that's kind of simple to do as well, because I hope you can see. Yeah, you can probably see the text for that. Okay. That form's really, really simple. It posts to Google's search URL with a get. Sorry, it performs a get to that URL, and then this input is the text string, the search query you're going to type. But we also hide another one, which also has the same name, just Q. And in that, we just qualify what site we want to search in. So it just focuses the search just on our domain. I noticed that Remy Sharp on JSBin recently started using the same method. This is a static site. The whole help section of his page there, built on Harp.js, works really nicely. Okay, comments. Now, comments are a tricky one. Comments obviously are incredibly valuable as something that you have on the web, and some people would really miss them if we didn't have them on a static site. So, how can we add those? Well, kind of have to think a little bit about how we might use comments as well. How timely should they be? Should you expect that when you post it, it's published immediately, or will they be perhaps moderated? And more often than not, you see these things being moderated. There are people who will look at them before they get posted. Now, again, I'm using my own site as an example for this, because I have a very, very manageable number of comments. So perhaps a very large site wouldn't want to perform it this way, but for small sites and for things that are a bit more modest, it works really nicely. So we have this kind of comment approval workflow. And there's a bunch of services that you could use to host your data for you, but they're all a little bit complex. So I actually made a little one called Pool, which is intended to be kind of a helper for a static site generator. And all that this does is it provides you somewhere to post data and get it back, and it's simple as that. And when you create a form, you get two things. You get an API key, which is just a hash, and you get an API secret, which is another hash. And when you post data to a URL with the API key, it goes into your bucket, And later on, you can do a get as long as with the associated API secret, you get your content back. And so adding that to anything is actually really trivial. So any HTML you like, you add a form like this, which has got the URL, the endpoint for this, which has your API key in it, and you perform a post. And then you add whichever fields you want, any kind of data you want, and that will post to that endpoint. Of course, if you follow that, that's going to take you to the pool site, but you don't really want the users to go there. So you can specify a URL to redirect to, so the users come straight back to that. They never leave your site. It's a very kind of seamless experience for them. And then you just submit it, as simple as that, and it goes into that bucket. And then to get that data back, then you can just do a GET request to the data endpoint with your secret, and you get your data back. That'll take you to a web page that has all of that, but equally you could get it back as JSON, or you could get it back as YAML. And this is what it looks like on the site. And you get a notification saying, okay, someone's posted some content. You want to take action to get it onto your site. And it means that you've got actually a bit of machinery that you can use to get the data as part of that build process. We mentioned earlier on automation and how that can simplify the update and the deployment of your site. So, just very quick example. I think we've just about got time to go through this. This is, again, I'm using my blog as the playground and the place to use an example. This is the blog post about this site, this service, so it kind of is nice and meta. And then down in the comment section, we add a comment, and we're going to post that. Eventually. And it should take us to the thank you page. So, it doesn't feel like it's gone to another service. It's taken us straight there. Then if we go over to Pool and we kind of look at the forms that I've got, can dig into that, and we should see that the latest piece of content is the thing that's just been posted. So it's great. That's there, and it's at the endpoint that I can then query later on to just kind of prove the point out. We can grab the JSON for that if we wanted, or we could download that as YAML. Moving along. Okay, so download that as YAML. But really, we don't want to go and interrogate it that way. We want it as part of our automated build process. So I use Gulp for my blog, and I've got a task called Gulp Comments, which is just going to go to that endpoint, grab all of the comments that were there, and then save them to one of those data files. I was talking about the Jekyll data files earlier on, how you can then iterate over that. And I'll just show you that file. So there it is. That's the data file that's got that latest post in it. So critically, that also means that this content doesn't just live on that third-party service now. You've got it. It's in your repository, and you can save it, do what you like with it. You're very portable. And then I've got another task, which is just to build it, which just runs the Jekyll build and kind of crunches the output and that kind of thing. So it kind of ticks along, takes a few seconds to run, and there we go. We've got a new site built. Now, typically, I might look at that myself before carrying on, but in this instance, I think I just go straight. I sod it. I'm just going to commit it, deploy it straight away. I'm obviously feeling brave, so I commit that post. So it's in my repository. It's all version controlled, even the comments. And then I just run the deploy, and then that pushes it up to GitHub. So it's kind of nice that the comments on this page aren't loaded in by Discuss or something like that, which is a very powerful tool for adding comments to static sites. But those comments aren't part of your page. They're not found by Google when they search your site. Here we go back to the page, and Bob's your uncle. There it is. Now, there's a few steps in there, but those can be squished down. I was demonstrating a few issues along the way, but frankly, three steps, and there are kind of notifications of the thing coming in at the top right. We can squish that down to just a couple of steps to say, okay, I've got a notification, grab the comments, build the site, deploy it, done. And it's just part of the process that you'd have anyway for moderating comments. So you can use that, of course, not just for comments. You can use it for contact forms, or frankly, you can use that thing for anywhere that you want to post some data and get it back. My cat flap monitor. Someone did mention I like cats earlier on. I'm not odd. Do talk to me afterwards. But it's all a candidate for using that kind of thing. So I'm just about out of time. So I want to just summarize by saying, this is kind of a call to arms for anyone who's involved in making stuff for the web. We've got lots of chances to simplify. We shouldn't just default to using the biggest, most expensive, most complex solution. We need to kind of challenge the need for that kind of complexity. And if we do that, then I think we can make stuff faster, and we can make stuff go faster. So that's it. I've got my thanks to the people that I stole photos from, and there's a bunch of links for resources that were in the deck. I'll tweet a link to the slides a little bit later on, but I think I'm kind of the only thing now standing between us and some tea. So thank you very much.